All right, 2024 MLB trade deadline, biggest winners and losers. Just going overall on the trade deadline, there were a lot of trades at the last moments, but nothing really super blockbuster this year. Of course, Randy Arozarena was one of the bigger ones that happened earlier, but other than that, there was no crazy trades coming out of left field. Now, starting with the winners, my biggest winners are the Miami Marlins and the Tampa Bay Rays. Now, just generally, both small market teams sold off at a high margin and got a lot of yield in return. Now, of course, with prospects, the results aren't going to be immediate, but both of these teams can really regrow in the next couple of years. Specifically for Tampa Bay, who got 17 players in return for the 9 that they sent out, some of which already big league ready, that being Christopher Morel and Dylan Carlson, the headline. I'm sure a couple others are as well, but those are the main two, and those guys are pretty good and young in their careers. Christopher Morel was a rookie last year, and I think Dylan Carlson the same. So both pretty much second-year Major League ready players for this Tampa team that now is younger than it was to start the season, but is still potentially a postseason team. They're only 3.5 games out of the wild card spot, even though they completely sold at this trade deadline. But that's the best part about Tampa, is they're going to hopefully crescendo in a couple of years where they make a really strong postseason run, but they're still good enough this year to maybe get in the dance. Probably won't make it far, but just be a disrupting factor going into October. As for Miami, from the last year's postseason team, they pretty much have sold or DFA'd every single player except a select few. But Miami pretty much had to make a major change this year due to the shakeup in the front office that occurred over this past offseason, that being their general manager Kim Hang leaving, who played a major role in the buildup of this previous Marlins team that made it to the playoffs last year. So she left, and well, this year has gone absolutely horrible for the Marlins team and organization in general. So what they needed is to completely scrap, do a whole do-over on the team, and well, this is what they did. They got rid of, like I said, pretty much every player they had from last year. Now they're starting fresh with a bunch of prospects. Just what Miami needs to do, and hopefully eventually, they can make it back to the playoffs with their new talent that they just acquired. But ultimately, this was the best move for Miami because they weren't going to do anything with this year. Their immediate future doesn't look really great, so they are committing to a full rebuild, and hopefully, in the future, they can make it out of it and actually be a good team. Now, moving over to the losers of the MLB trade deadline, I have the Chicago White Sox and the Baltimore Orioles. Now, starting with the Chicago White Sox, like the Marlins and the Rays, they were in a prime position to sell off the majority of their team for a great deal of prospects in return, but they just didn't quite get the return that they needed. They traded a lot of their big guys, except for Luis Robert and Garrett Crochet. Garrett Crochet didn't want to leave for contract reasons, but they traded pretty much everyone they could, and they really didn't get a whole lot in return. Now, a lot of those players could pan out and they could be good for Chicago, but immediate reaction to it, they really didn't get as much as they could have for the players they dealt. One of the big trades that really didn't help them at all was sending over Eric Fetty, Tommy Pham, and Michael Kopech in a 3-team deal with the Cardinals and the Dodgers. They got a couple of names in return, Miguel Vargas, one of the better ones, but he really hasn't panned out well for the Dodgers, and of course, like the Dodgers, they should have the best prospects, whereas if they go to Chicago, they probably won't play as well. So Chicago really didn't do much with what they had at the trade deadline, what they could have done, and as a result, they're going to stay in kind of the bad position that they've been in and continue to be in. Now, moving over to the Baltimore Orioles, the moves they made weren't bad, but they more felt like a patchwork instead of a total renovation. Now, what I mean by that is they needed a major starting pitcher, and they went out and got Zach Eflin, which he can be good at times, but he can also be pretty bad at times. And in this market, there were some big names that were available, like Tarek Skubal and Garrett Crochet, to name the first two. But they really didn't get that much. They got a bunch of mid-level guys that aren't really, in my mind, going to help them win this year. Now, if Baltimore is saving up to go big next year to try to win it all next year, that's understandable, and the moves they made at the deadline would hopefully help that for next year. However, if they want to win this year, I don't feel like they made the right moves to really put themselves in a really good position to make a deep run into October. Now, like the Yankees, they made good moves that got them players they really needed in Jazz Chisholm. That was a major move. But really, Baltimore didn't pair that with anything. Now, they just called up Jackson Holliday, and maybe he can be their Jazz Chisholm. But Baltimore's problem is their pitching. They really don't have that many good starters, and their bullpen is shoddy at best. and as a result, they really didn't patch it up that well. Sir Anthony Dominguez isn't bad, as is Gregory Soto, but the problem is they really didn't get a premier guy that's really going to help that team in the long run. And in my mind, I felt like they really cut short what they could have done. Now, sure, it was a seller's market, and they didn't really want to get taken advantage of that way, but if anyone has a lot of breathing room to play around with prospects, in my mind, it's Baltimore, and they could have spent some of their high prospects to get immediately better for this year to try to make a deep run this year. Now, you can tell they're not in a win-now mode. They're planning to be a contender for the next couple of years, but in my mind, in this year, with no real team significantly improving at the deadline, say other than Philadelphia, they really filled a major hole they had. Baltimore needed to make major moves at this trade deadline to put them in the best spot to win the World Series this year, and they didn't do it. And for that reason, that's why they're my biggest loser, because they didn't do what they could have done that would have really put them in a prime position to win the whole thing. Now, of course, other teams didn't make moves where they should have, or did some things that didn't really make sense, but ultimately I find Chicago White Sox and the Orioles as the two teams that messed up the most for what they could have done. Comment below with who you think were the biggest winners and losers of the trade deadline, and as always, like and follow for more.